Women born without eyes after generations of incest in the Appalachians, the cruelest face of consanguinity. This dark tale begins in 1923, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of a remote Tennessee region. It was a time when the mountains served as natural barriers, isolating entire communities from civilization. In these lands forgotten by time, where the law seldom reached, one family became the epicenter of a genetic tragedy that would span generations. The Caldwells were known among locals as the people of the shadows. Settled in the mountains since the late 18th century, they occupied a secluded valley far from any town. Led by patriarch Jedediah Caldwell, the family lived by subsistence farming and hunting, fiercely resisting any integration with neighboring communities. But geographic isolation was only part of the problem. The Caldwells nurtured a deep contempt for the outside world, fed by old family tales of persecution and injustice. This self-imposed isolation created the perfect conditions for a practice that would become their darkest legacy: marriage between close relatives. "Pure blood keeps the family strong," was Jedediah's mantra, repeated to his children and grandchildren. This mistaken belief, in fact, was not uncommon in that era and region. Many isolated Appalachian communities, by necessity or tradition, practiced cousin marriage. But the Caldwells took it to extremes rarely documented. In 1925, Marion Caldwell, Jedediah's daughter, gave birth to a girl named Eliza. The father was her own first cousin, Thomas Caldwell. The child was born with a disturbing peculiarity: where her eyes should have been, there were only small empty cavities covered by thin skin. The midwife, one of the few outsiders allowed on the property, was horrified. Yet to the Caldwells, the child's condition was blamed on evil spirits or a divine curse. Word of the eyeless child eventually reached Dr. William Forrester, a physician from the nearest town. Concerned and intrigued, he tried to visit the family to examine the child, but was met with pointed shotguns and threats. The doctor, however, did not give up easily. For the next 5 years, he carefully documented every rumor and report about the Caldwells that came his way. In his journal, found decades later by researchers, Dr. Forrester wrote, "I grow increasingly convinced the Caldwell condition is not a curse, but the result of unions between those of close blood. Science is beginning to understand the dangers of such unions, though isolated communities remain ignorant of these facts." In 1931, another birth in the Caldwell family drew attention. Martha Caldwell, Marion's cousin, gave birth to twins. One girl was born with the same condition as Eliza, completely eyeless. The other had eyes but suffered other deformities, including twisted fingers and a severe curvature of the spine. Upon learning of this new case, Dr. Forrester wrote to the Tennessee Department of Health, warning of a potential public health crisis. His letter, preserved in the state archives, contains the first documented mention of what would later be called Caldwell blindness. "We are witnessing the tragic result of isolation and ignorance," he wrote. "These children are victims not only of their physical conditions, but of family practices that perpetuate and amplify congenital defects." The authorities' response was slow and inadequate. In 1932, a health officer was sent to investigate but, like Dr. Forrester, was barred from the Caldwell property. The official report concluded that, lacking direct evidence and out of respect for local traditions, no further action would be taken. This was the first of many systemic failures regarding the Caldwell children. Over the following decades, the family continued their consanguineous marriages, isolated from public scrutiny, while the number of children born with severe genetic deformities quietly grew. The Great Depression of 1934 hit the region hard. The few interactions the Caldwells maintained with the outside world, mainly to sell furs and buy essentials, became even rarer. The family turned further inward, deepening their isolation and mutual dependence. It was then that Jedediah Caldwell, then 70, laid down a rule that would seal the family's fate: no member would be permitted to marry outside the family. "The world out there is dying," he declared. "We will survive only by keeping our blood strong and pure." The Caldwell tragedy was not an isolated event in Appalachian history. Other secluded communities faced similar issues, though rarely so severe. What made the Caldwell case particularly devastating was the combination of extreme geographical isolation, a family ideology actively promoting consanguinity, and persistent neglect by public authorities. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. The Caldwell story reveals a dark side of American history few know, a secret buried in the mountains that will forever change how you see isolation and heredity. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapters of this exclusive investigation into the deepest secrets of the Appalachians. The 1940s brought significant change to rural America, but Caldwell Valley remained nearly untouched by progress. While the rest of the country faced World War II and social transformation, the family continued its cycle of isolation and inbred reproduction, further removed from society's gaze. In 1943, a crucial event shifted the family's fate. A severe storm destroyed the only bridge connecting Caldwell Valley to the outside world. Naturally isolated, the Caldwells were now completely cut off from civilization. To most family members, this was not a calamity, but a blessing, the very isolation Jedediah had always wanted. By then, Eliza Caldwell, the first known eyeless child, was 18. Despite her blindness, she had developed remarkable compensatory senses. Her hearing was so sharp she could identify each family member by their footsteps. Her hands, trained to replace her missing eyes, could read the soil's texture to predict weather, a valuable skill for a farming family. But Eliza carried another burden. As later testimonies revealed, she had been chosen as a wife for her uncle, Joshua Caldwell, her father's younger brother. This arrangement, decided in her childhood, was part of Jedediah's strategy to strengthen the bloodline. The marriage would occur when she turned 18, a practice considered abominable even in that isolated region. It was Sarah Caldwell, Eliza's aunt and one of the few family members who occasionally visited town before the bridge was destroyed, who first began to question the family's ways. During her rare trips, she had overheard talk of bad blood and genetic weakness caused by relatives. These ideas, however rudimentarily understood, planted seeds of doubt in her mind. In the spring of 1943, as preparations for Eliza's wedding began, Sarah confronted Jedediah. "Can't you see you're condemning more children to be born like Eliza?" she reportedly asked. Furious at this challenge to his authority, Jedediah banished Sarah from the family council. Determined to stop the wedding, Sarah did the unthinkable. She fled the valley, swimming across the river that now, without the bridge, formed a formidable barrier. Soaked and exhausted, she reached town and sought out Dr. Forrester, who still held an interest in the Caldwell case after all these years. The doctor, now elderly but bound by ethics, immediately contacted the authorities. This time, unlike in 1932, the response was more decisive. America was at war, and the federal government was exercising unprecedented authority in domestic affairs. A district attorney, accompanied by state police, organized an expedition to Caldwell Valley. The intervention turned violent. Jedediah and two of his sons were killed in a shootout with authorities. The remaining family members, including Eliza, were removed from the valley for medical and psychological evaluation. The Caldwell property was temporarily seized by the state pending investigation. Medical examinations revealed the full extent of the damage wrought by generations of inbreeding. Of the 32 people removed from the valley, 14 had significant deformities. Beyond the eyeless children, doctors documented severe intellectual disabilities, heart malformations, and various skeletal conditions. A medical report from the time noted, "It is as though we are observing the results of a cruel experiment on the effects of prolonged inbreeding in humans." The Caldwell case quickly became a case study in eugenics, the now discredited science advocating reproductive control to improve the human genetic pool. Unfortunately, the findings were often misunderstood and used to justify discriminatory policies against isolated rural communities. For Eliza and the other Caldwell women born without eyes, the intervention brought mixed outcomes. On one hand, they finally received medical care and were protected from further forced consanguineous unions. On the other, many were placed in state institutions for the disabled, where they often received dehumanizing treatment. Dr. Harold Jenkins, a University of Tennessee geneticist who studied the case in 1945, was the first to correctly identify the specific condition affecting the Caldwell women, congenital bilateral anophthalmia, the complete absence of eyes at birth. In his study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, he wrote, "The extraordinarily high prevalence of bilateral anophthalmia among Caldwell women strongly suggests an X-linked recessive gene amplified through generations of consanguineous union. In normal populations, the condition occurs in approximately 1 in 100,000 births. Among the Caldwells, the rate is roughly 1 in 3 female births, an alarming frequency that vividly demonstrates the dangers of prolonged inbreeding." Dr. Jenkins's study was groundbreaking, establishing one of the first documented scientific links between prolonged inbreeding and the dramatic increase in deleterious recessive genes. His findings would be cited for decades in discussions on public policy regarding consanguinity. Meanwhile, the lives of the Caldwell women continued. Eliza, who had never left the valley before, faced immense challenges adapting. Without the family landmarks she navigated by in her familiar environment, and lacking social skills to interact with strangers, she sank into a deep depression initially. It was a nurse named Margaret Wilson who finally connected with Eliza. Through months of patience, Margaret taught Eliza Braille and how to use a cane. Gradually, Eliza began to forge a new identity, separate from her family's oppressive traditions. In 1947, Eliza gave detailed testimony about life in Caldwell Valley. Preserved in the state archives, it offers a rare window into the inner life of this isolated family. She described how, from childhood, she was prepared for her role in preserving the bloodline, and how children born with deformities were seen as both cursed and special, as marked by God for a purpose within the family. The 1950s marked a new era in the scientific understanding of human genetics, and consequently, of the Caldwell case. The discovery of DNA structure by Watson and Crick in 1953 revolutionized genetics, allowing scientists to unravel the molecular mechanisms behind hereditary conditions like the Caldwell women's anophthalmia. Dr. Richard Harmon, a Harvard University geneticist, revisited the case in 1956 with new theoretical tools. His study of medical records and Caldwell genealogical trees enabled precise mapping of the condition's inheritance pattern. In his seminal paper, Patterns of Inheritance in Genetic Isolates, The Caldwell Case, he wrote, "Analysis of Caldwell genealogy reveals a classic X-linked recessive pattern. Men, with their single X chromosome, serve as carriers when affected but do not manifest the condition. Women, with 2 X chromosomes, manifest the condition only when inheriting the mutant gene from both parents. In exogamous populations, such coincidence would be extremely rare. However, after generations of inbreeding, the frequency of the mutant allele in the Caldwell gene pool reached alarming levels, resulting in the high incidence of bilateral anophthalmia among family women." Dr. Harmon's work helped destigmatize the Caldwell women's condition, shifting the narrative from superstition and moral judgment toward objective science. Yet the women themselves continued to face prejudice and social isolation. In 1957, journalist Eleanor Patterson located Eliza Caldwell, then 32, living in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee. Eliza had been one of the few Caldwell survivors to transition to an independent life after years of institutionalization. With help from charities and compassionate citizens, she had learned to weave baskets, providing a modest income. Eleanor's interview with Eliza, published in Life magazine under the title The Woman Without Eyes, a Survivor of the Mountains, brought national attention to the Caldwell case. For the first time, the American public had a first-person narrative on the effects of extreme inbreeding. "Many people think I was born into darkness," Eliza was quoted as saying. "But I had my own form of light. I knew every sound, every smell, every curve of the valley. That was my world. What truly plunged me into darkness was learning the truth about my family, that we weren't special or chosen, as we were told, but victims of ignorance and isolation." The article included striking photographs of Eliza, showing her profile with empty eye sockets delicately covered by permanently closed eyelids. The images shocked middle-class America, sparking discussions about rural health, geographical isolation, and the dangers of endogamy. After this report, several surviving Caldwell women began meeting, forming an informal support group. Martha Caldwell, one of the twins born in 1931, emerged as its leader. Unlike her sister, who had died young from heart complications related to her genetic conditions, Martha had survived and developed considerable resilience. Using a tape recorder donated by a local church, Martha began collecting survivor testimonies. These recordings, later donated to the Tennessee Historical Archives, became an invaluable resource for understanding life within the isolated Caldwell community. In one of the most haunting recordings, Ruth Caldwell, born in 1939 and also eyeless, describes being prepared from childhood to marry her uncle. "They told us we were special vessels chosen to carry the family's pure blood. Our blindness was seen as a sign that we belonged solely to the family, that we should never look to the outside world. We believed it. How could we not? It was all we knew." Have you ever wondered what it would be like to grow up in complete isolation, believing your genetic condition was a blessing, not a curse? Comment "Isolation kills" below if you believe access to education and healthcare could have prevented this tragedy. The recordings also reveal how the Caldwell family developed its own mythology to explain and justify their practices. Eyeless women were called inner seers, supposedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to the sighted. This mystical interpretation elevated their status within the family, even as it prepared them for a life of reproductive submission. During the 1960s, the Caldwell case began attracting anthropologists and sociologists interested in isolated community dynamics. Dr. Thomas Bennett of the University of Chicago spent 3 years studying case records and interviewing survivors. His 1968 book, Valley Dwellers, Isolation, Kinship, and Culture in Appalachia, became a seminal work. Bennett argued that the Caldwell case should not be viewed simply as an aberration or the result of superstition and ignorance, but as the extreme product of social, economic, and geographical forces shaping many Appalachian communities. "The Caldwells represent an extreme but not unique case," he wrote. "Across Appalachia, geographical isolation, poverty, and historical distrust of outside authority have created conditions conducive to endogamous communities. When combined with lack of access to education and healthcare, we create fertile ground for tragedies like the Caldwells." Bennett's work was revolutionary, contextualizing the case within broader sociological analysis rather than treating it as a medical curiosity or sensationalist narrative about rural degeneration, the approach that had dominated earlier discussions. In 1965, an unexpected tragedy brought the Caldwell case back into public view. Eliza Caldwell, then 40, was found dead in her Knoxville apartment. The investigation concluded she had taken her own life, leaving a brief note that read only, "I am tired of being an example, a case study, a lesson. I just want to be remembered as a woman." Her death prompted a re-evaluation of how Caldwell survivors had been treated by the medical system and media. Many began questioning whether the constant exposure and clinical analysis of their lives was another form of exploitation, perpetuating their suffering in a new guise. The 1970s brought significant advances in the scientific understanding of the Caldwell case, alongside changes in the survivors' lives. With more sophisticated genetic analysis techniques, researchers at Johns Hopkins University identified the specific mutation responsible for the Caldwell women's anophthalmia. Dr. Michael Stern, who led the study, published his findings in 1973 in the Journal of Medical Genetics. His research identified a mutation in the SOX3 gene on the X chromosome as the likely cause. This discovery was revolutionary, one of the first instances where a complex human genetic condition was traced to a specific mutation. The Caldwell mutation, as we are calling it, offers an unprecedented glimpse into the molecular mechanisms of human eye development, Dr. Stern wrote. The fact that this mutation is rare in general populations but reached high frequency in the Caldwell family serves as a powerful example of founder effect amplified by generations of consanguineous marriage. The founder effect Dr. Stern referred to is a genetic principle where loss of variation occurs when a new population is established by very few individuals, as when Jedediah Caldwell and his family isolated themselves in the mountains. Combined with repeated inbreeding, this effect can lead to high expression of rare genetic traits, exactly what happened with anophthalmia among Caldwell women. As science advanced, Caldwell survivors continued their personal journeys. Martha Caldwell, the group's informal spokesperson, was invited in 1974 to speak at a rural health conference in Washington, D.C. Her presentation, Beyond Darkness, The Lived Experience of Consanguinity, marked the first time a Caldwell woman addressed the medical and political community directly. In her speech, preserved in the conference archives, Martha challenged the prevailing narrative: "You have studied us as specimens, catalogued our deformities, mapped our genes, but rarely asked what it is like to live in our bodies, our minds. We are not merely examples of defective genetics. We are women with hopes, fears, and dreams. And yes, we are survivors, not only of our biology, but of a belief system that valued purity above health and well-being." Martha's speech had a significant impact, inspiring a more humanistic approach to studying communities affected by genetic conditions. She was later invited to help develop educational materials about the risks of consanguinity for isolated rural communities. In 1976, a surprising discovery added another layer to the Caldwell story. Historian Robert Williams, surveying a local church archive, found parish records from 1798 documenting the arrival of Ezekiel Caldwell, Jedediah's father, to the region. The records revealed Ezekiel had fled his home county in North Carolina after being accused of unnatural practices, a euphemism often used for incestuous relationships. This discovery suggested the Caldwells' consanguineous practices predated their Appalachian isolation, reversing earlier understanding of causality. It wasn't simply isolation that led to inbreeding; rather, the family may have sought isolation to continue practices already considered taboo even in the late 18th century. In his book Buried Roots: The True Origin of the Caldwell Tragedy, historian Williams argued this broader historical context was crucial. The Caldwells were not merely victims of geographical circumstance and ignorance. Their story begins with a deliberate choice to isolate in order to escape social scrutiny, followed by the construction of a belief system that justified and sanctified practices they knew were condemned by wider society. This is not a simple tale of environmental determinism, but of complex interplay between choice, circumstance, and consequence across generations. This reassessment sparked intense debate. Some criticized Williams for downplaying the socio-economic and geographical factors that shaped the Caldwell community, while others praised his approach for restoring the family's historical agency rather than portraying them as passive victims. In 1978, a PBS documentary titled In the Shadow of the Mountains, the Caldwell story brought the case to an even wider national audience. It included interviews with Martha and other survivors, as well as doctors, geneticists, and historians who had studied the case over decades. One of the documentary's most powerful scenes shows Martha Caldwell returning to the now-abandoned valley where she grew up, partially reclaimed by forest. Walking with a cane, she navigated the ground with surprising ease, guided by tactile and auditory memories. "Here," she said, stopping at a specific spot, "is where we would sit at night to hear Grandfather Jedediah's stories about our ancestors. He told us we were special, chosen to preserve something precious the outside world would never understand. As children, we believed it was a privilege. Only later did we understand it was a prison." The documentary won an Emmy and sparked renewed public interest, coinciding with broader 1970s debates on reproductive rights, consent, and the limits of government intervention in cultural and family practices. For the survivors, now middle-aged, this renewed attention brought both opportunity and challenge. Some received offers of advanced medical treatments, including cosmetic ocular prostheses that could improve appearance, if not restore sight. Others expressed weariness with the continual public and scientific scrutiny of their lives. Ruth Caldwell, in a rare 1979 interview with Time magazine, captured this ambivalence: "We have spent our lives being studied, analyzed, discussed. Our bodies have been treated as texts for science to read. Our stories as cautionary tales. I do not deny the importance of what medicine learned from us, nor the value of warning other communities about the dangers of inbreeding. But sometimes I wonder, when does the observation end, and the living begin?" The early 1980s marked a new phase for the Caldwell women, characterized by reconciliation with their past and the pursuit of a positive legacy. In 1982, Martha Caldwell established the Caldwell Foundation for Genetic Awareness, a non-profit dedicated to educating isolated rural communities about the risks of consanguinity. Though modest in resources, the foundation was ambitious. It produced simple, accessible educational materials using clear illustrations and straightforward explanations of basic genetics. Pamphlets and booklets were distributed through isolated Appalachian regions, often with the help of community health workers and local religious leaders. We are not here to judge or condemn traditions, Martha often explained in her presentations. We are here to share information that was not available to our family, knowledge that could have prevented so much suffering. The effectiveness of these efforts is hard to quantify, but anecdotal reports suggest they contributed to reducing close relative marriages in several isolated communities. The Foundation's work also helped destigmatize discussion of consanguinity, transforming it from a shameful taboo into a public health topic that could be addressed openly. In 1983, Martha testified before a congressional subcommittee on rural health. Her eloquent testimony on the long-term consequences of geographical isolation and lack of access to healthcare and education helped secure federal funding for medical outreach programs in remote Appalachian regions. The mountains that isolated us are not just geographical, she told legislators. They are economic and social. To break the cycle of isolation that leads to practices like those that destroyed my family, we need to build bridges, not just physical ones, but bridges of knowledge, care, and understanding. While Martha pursued public activism, other Caldwell survivors found different paths. Ruth Caldwell, uncomfortable with the spotlight, found purpose working with blind children. Drawing on her own experience navigating without sight, she became a respected instructor at a school for the blind in Nashville, teaching generations of children to develop their tactile and auditory senses. In a 1984 interview with a local newspaper, Ruth reflected, "For a long time, I saw my condition only as a curse, a burden I carried because of my ancestors' mistakes. But through my work with these children, I've come to see my experience as a source of unique understanding. I can teach from a place of genuine insight that other instructors, however dedicated, simply do not have." In 1985, another significant event brought the Caldwell survivors back into national focus. Dr. James Harrison, a neurologist specializing in sensory perception, published a groundbreaking study on the extraordinary auditory and tactile abilities developed by the eyeless Caldwell women. His study, published in Nature, documented how these women had repurposed areas of the brain typically dedicated to visual processing to heighten other senses. Brain scans of Martha, Ruth, and 3 other Caldwell survivors revealed neural activity patterns that challenged previous understanding of brain plasticity and sensory adaptation. Dr. Harrison concluded the women had effectively rewired their brains in response to their congenital condition, developing sensory abilities rivaling or exceeding those documented in individuals who lost vision later in life. The Caldwell brain, as it became informally known in scientific literature, became an important case study in neuroplasticity. What began as a genetic tragedy had inadvertently created a natural laboratory for studying human brain adaptation. Always pragmatic, Martha commented to Scientific American, "It is some comfort to know something useful to science came from our pain. But let's be clear, no scientific discovery is worth the price our family paid. Given the choice, we would exchange all this knowledge for a normal childhood for each of us." In 1987, an unexpected development added yet another layer. A 25-year-old woman named Rebecca Miller contacted the Caldwell Foundation, claiming to be a descendant of Sarah Caldwell, the aunt who had alerted authorities in 1943. According to Rebecca, her grandmother Sarah had left Tennessee after the incident, changed her name, and rarely spoke of her past. Only on her deathbed in 1986 did Sarah reveal her true identity and give Rebecca a diary she had kept during her years with the Caldwells. Sarah's diary, later donated to the Tennessee Historical Archives, offered an extraordinary window into daily life in the isolated Caldwell community during the 1920s and 1930s. Written in meticulous script, it detailed not only the family's consanguineous practices but also the complex belief system that sustained them. Sarah described how Jedediah Caldwell had developed an idiosyncratic theology blending fundamentalist Christianity, Appalachian folk traditions, and his own mystical interpretations, a theology positioning the Caldwells as a chosen lineage whose blood must remain undiluted. Particularly disturbing were Sarah's accounts of how the eyeless women were treated. Far from being hidden or neglected, they were celebrated as inner seers, allegedly capable of perceiving spiritual truths inaccessible to normal people. This veneration, however, coexisted with their exploitation as perpetuators of the sacred lineage, a euphemism for their role in arranged inbred unions. The diary also revealed Sarah had tried multiple times before 1943 to warn authorities, only to be ignored or dismissed. Only when Eliza's forced marriage to her uncle was imminent, scheduled within a week, did Sarah make her desperate escape. An edited version of the diary was published in 1988 as Witness in the Valley, The Diary of Sarah Caldwell, becoming a national bestseller and inspiring renewed discussion on cultural isolation, patriarchal authority, and women's roles in closed communities. It also provoked debate on authorities' responsibility to intervene in harmful cultural practices, even within isolated, resistant communities. For Martha and the other survivors, Sarah's diary provided long-awaited validation. For decades, we struggled to make people believe the extent and systematic nature of what happened in our valley, Martha said upon the book's release. Sarah's diary confirms what we always knew, but also reveals how much sooner our tragedy could have been stopped, if only someone had listened. By the late 1980s, the Caldwell case had moved from obscurity to a canonical case study in medical genetics, neuroscience, and cultural anthropology. The survivors, now elderly, had found various ways to reconcile with their past and build meaningful lives despite their traumatic origins. Martha Caldwell continued her foundation work until her death in 1991 at age 60. Her funeral was attended not only by the few remaining survivors, but by dozens of medical professionals, researchers, and activists whose careers and perspectives had been deeply shaped by her work and testimony. Her New York Times obituary described her as a woman who transformed a dark inheritance into a mission of illumination, noting, born without eyes due to generations of inbreeding, Martha Caldwell dedicated her life to ensuring other communities did not repeat the mistakes that devastated her family. Her legacy endures not only in medical genetics, where the Caldwell case remains a seminal study, but in the countless families spared similar suffering thanks to her educational efforts. Ruth Caldwell continued her work with blind children until retiring in 1994, receiving multiple awards for her pioneering sensory teaching techniques. She died in 1998 at 59, leaving a legacy of pedagogical innovation that still influences visual impairment education today. Scientific discoveries related to the Caldwell case continued in subsequent decades. In 1995, University of Michigan researchers pinpointed the exact genetic mutation responsible for the Caldwell women's anophthalmia, a deletion in the SOX3 gene affecting early eye development. This finding significantly advanced understanding of human ocular embryogenesis. In 2002, a comprehensive study by geneticist Dr. Lawrence Klein analyzed DNA from over 200 indirect Caldwell descendants across the United States. It revealed approximately 1 in 40 residents in certain Appalachian regions carries the Caldwell mutation in recessive form, a silent testament to the dispersal of the family's genes through subsequent generations. The Caldwell case remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, scientific ignorance, and harmful traditions upheld in the name of purity or preservation. Yet it is also a story of extraordinary human resilience, adaptation, and the capacity to transform personal suffering into social progress. The women born without eyes in the Appalachians, victims of generations of inbreeding, ultimately found ways to see beyond the limits imposed by their genetics and culture. Through their testimonies, activism, and simply by living with dignity, they illuminated dark corners of human experience and helped create a more informed and compassionate world. If you've made it this far, you're clearly engaged by this story. Leave a comment saying "watched here" so I can recognize you and know who truly appreciates the narratives on this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to join our community and discover more astonishing, impactful stories like this one. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these powerful tales to light, stories that uncover the darkest secrets of human experience. Don't forget to like and share with friends who also appreciate profound true stories. The mountains hold many more secrets, and we'll be here to reveal them to you, one chapter at a time.